The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as I settled into my usual Sunday routine. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air while I spread the newspaper across my wooden table, ready to dive into my peaceful weekend ritual. My house wasn't anything fancy, but it was my sanctuary after the divorce, a place where I could finally breathe freely and rebuild my life piece by piece. I had just taken my first sip of coffee when the doorbell rang. Strange, I thought, since I wasn't expecting anyone this early. The sound felt like an unwelcome intrusion into my quiet morning. Setting down my coffee mug, I walked to the door, my slippers shuffling against the hardwood floor. The moment I opened the door, my peaceful Sunday morning shattered like glass. There they stood, my ex-wife and her new husband, both dressed like they were heading to a business meeting rather than making a casual weekend visit. My ex-wife wore that familiar smile, the one that always appeared when she thought she had the upper hand. Her new husband stood beside her, chest puffed out slightly, with an expensive watch glinting on his wrist and a leather briefcase in his hand. My stomach dropped. In the 3 years since our divorce, my ex-wife had never once come to my house. Now here she was, standing on my front porch with her new husband like they owned the place. The cool morning air drifted in, but I felt a bead of sweat form on my forehead. "Well, this is a surprise," I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady. The newspaper on my kitchen table suddenly felt miles away, along with any hope of a peaceful Sunday. My ex-wife's smile widened just a fraction, while her husband shifted his weight and adjusted his grip on the briefcase. The morning sun caught her wedding ring, newer and bigger than the one I had given her years ago, as she raised her hand in a small wave. "We need to talk," she said, her voice carrying that business-like tone I remembered from our worst arguments. "It's about the house." Those 4 words sent a chill down my spine. I had been renting this place for the past 3 years, slowly putting my life back together within these walls. Every picture I'd hung, every piece of furniture I'd carefully chosen, every corner where I'd built new memories, all of it suddenly felt threatened. I glanced between them, noting how they stood slightly too close to each other, how they seemed to be savoring this moment. The husband's expensive suit and my ex-wife's designer dress suddenly made sense. They weren't dressed for a casual visit. They were dressed for what they thought would be a victory. Time seemed to slow down as I stood in my doorway, still in my weekend clothes, coffee growing cold on my kitchen table. The neighbor's dog barked in the distance, kids rode their bikes down the street, and somewhere a lawnmower hummed. The world going about its normal Sunday morning, while my reality tilted on its axis. "Would you like to come in?" I heard myself ask, stepping aside. Sometimes the best way to face a storm is to walk right into it. They exchanged a quick glance, probably surprised by my calm demeanor, before stepping into my home. Little did they know, this was just the beginning of a story that would end very differently from what they had planned. As I closed the door behind them, I couldn't help but think about the documents safely stored in my home office, documents that would soon wipe those smug looks off their faces. I led them into my living room, watching as they took in the space I'd made my own since the divorce. My ex-wife's eyes lingered on the family photos I'd replaced with landscape photographs, while her husband seemed more interested in assessing the property value. The leather briefcase made a soft thud as he set it on my coffee table. "Nice place you've made for yourself," my ex-wife said, but her tone suggested she wasn't paying a compliment. "Though I suppose you'll need to start packing it up soon." I settled into my favorite armchair, the one I'd bought during a particularly good sale last winter. "And why would that be?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the knot forming in my stomach. Her husband cleared his throat, clearly enjoying his moment in the spotlight. "Well," he began, pulling some papers from his briefcase, "my company has recently acquired Riverside Property Management." He paused, watching for my reaction. "I believe they're your current landlord." The pieces started falling into place. I remembered the letter I'd received a few months back about a change in ownership, though it hadn't mentioned any specific company names. My coffee sat forgotten in the kitchen, but suddenly my mouth felt very dry. "As the new owners," he continued, straightening his expensive tie, "we're making some changes to the property portfolio. Unfortunately, your lease won't be renewed. In fact, we're exercising our right to terminate it early. You'll have 30 days to vacate the premises." My ex-wife's smile grew wider as she watched me process this information. The morning sun streaming through my windows felt colder somehow. 3 years of building a new life in this house, and they thought they could sweep it all away with a few pieces of paper. We thought it would be more personal to deliver the notice ourselves, she added, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Given our history. I looked around my living room, at the bookshelf I'd assembled myself, the throw pillows I'd picked out to add a splash of color, the corner where I'd set up my reading nook. Each item held a memory of my recovery after the divorce, of slowly piecing myself back together. That's very thoughtful of you, I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Though I have to wonder, out of all the properties your company acquired, why did mine require a personal visit? Her husband shifted in his seat, but my ex-wife didn't miss a beat. We just wanted to make sure there wouldn't be any difficulties. Moving can be so stressful, after all. The family across the street was having a barbecue. I could smell it through the open window, along with the sound of children laughing. Such a normal Sunday afternoon while my world was supposedly being turned upside down. And I suppose you've already got plans for the property? I asked, though I already knew the answer. We're thinking of doing some renovations, her husband replied, his voice full of artificial professionalism. The neighborhood's property values are rising, and with a few upgrades, this place could fetch a much higher rent. My ex-wife leaned forward slightly. Though I suppose we could be persuaded to let you stay, at the new market rate, of course. It would be nearly double your current rent, but given your attachment to the place. I could see it all so clearly, how they planned this, how they probably rehearsed this conversation, how they expected me to react. They wanted to see me scramble, to beg, to show any sign of the devastation they were sure they'd caused. Instead, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. Sometimes life has a way of preparing you for moments like these, even when you don't realize it. As I sat there, listening to them outline their plans for my home, I thought about the documents sitting in my home office. That's quite an interesting proposition, I said, standing up slowly. Would you mind if I got us some coffee? I think we have a lot to discuss. They exchanged triumphant glances, probably mistaking my calmness for resignation. My ex-wife nodded graciously, likely imagining me using the kitchen break to pull myself together. As I walked to the kitchen, I could hear them whispering to each other, no doubt congratulating themselves on their perfectly executed plan. Little did they know, their surprise visit was about to take a very unexpected turn. I smiled to myself as I reached for the coffee cups, knowing that sometimes the best defense is being prepared for the worst. As I poured the coffee in the kitchen, my hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the rush of memories that suddenly flooded back. The divorce papers being served at my office, the endless arguments over who got what, the sleepless nights wondering how everything had fallen apart so quickly. Now here they were, sitting in my living room, thinking they could tear down everything I'd rebuilt. I added cream to my ex-wife's coffee. She still took it the same way, I remembered. Some habits are hard to forget, even when you want to. Her new husband's cup I left black, making an educated guess based on his personality type. The mugs clinked against the tray as I carried them back to the living room. Thank you, my ex-wife said, accepting her coffee with that familiar tilt of her head. You always did make it just right. Her husband shot her a quick glance, and she immediately straightened up, remembering her role in their little power play. I settled back into my chair, taking a moment to look around the room. The morning light had shifted, casting long shadows across the floor. My wall clock ticked steadily, marking each second of this surreal encounter. Outside, a car alarm went off briefly before falling silent. So, I said, taking a sip from my fresh cup, 30 days to find a new place, pack up everything and move out. I kept my voice casual, as if we were discussing weekend plans rather than them trying to uproot my life. Her husband nodded, clearly pleased with himself. The paperwork is all in order, he said, patting his briefcase like it was a loyal pet. We're being more than fair with the timeline. Some tenants only get 2 weeks' notice. I watched as my ex-wife's hand found his knee, a gesture of support that used to be reserved for me. The diamond on her new ring caught the sunlight, throwing tiny rainbows across the wall. It was probably worth 3 months of my rent. You know, I said, setting down my coffee cup, this house has been good to me. When I first moved in, it was just a place to sleep, somewhere to exist while I figured out what came next. I ran my hand along the armrest of my chair, feeling the familiar texture. But over time, it became more than that. It became home. My ex-wife's smile faltered slightly. This wasn't the reaction she'd expected. No pleading, no anger, no visible signs of distress, just quiet reflection. That's what makes this business, her husband cut in, emphasizing the last word. Nothing personal, just market forces at work. I almost laughed at that. Nothing personal. They'd driven across town on a Sunday morning to deliver an eviction notice in person. They'd dressed up for the occasion. They'd probably planned this moment for weeks, maybe months. The family photos I'd taken down after the divorce seemed to leave shadows on the walls where they'd once hung. In their place, I'd put up pictures of places I wanted to visit, dreams I was finally free to chase. Each image represented a small victory, a step forward. You know what I learned after the divorce? I said, surprising even myself with the question. They both stiffened slightly, not expecting this turn in the conversation. I learned that the worst moments in life often come disguised as endings, but sometimes they're actually beginnings in disguise. My ex-wife's coffee cup clinked against its saucer. That's very philosophical of you, she said, her voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. But philosophy won't find you a new place to live. I stood up slowly, straightening my weekend shirt. You're right about that, I said, walking toward my home office. But I think I have something that might be more helpful than philosophy. Where are you going? Her husband asked, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. Just getting some papers of my own, I called back over my shoulder. After all, you're not the only one who's been busy lately. As I reached for my office door handle, I could hear them whispering urgently to each other. The confidence in their voices had dimmed, replaced by something that sounded a lot like worry. They'd come to my house expecting to find the same broken man from 3 years ago. Instead, they'd found someone they didn't recognize, someone who'd learned from the past rather than being trapped by it. I pulled open my filing cabinet, reaching for the folder I'd prepared months ago. Sometimes the best defense isn't just being prepared for the worst, it's being prepared for something your opponents never saw coming. As I walked back to the living room, I couldn't help but smile. Their surprise visit was about to become a very different kind of surprise. The folder in my hands felt heavier than its actual weight as I walked back to the living room. Inside was 6 months of careful planning, countless phone calls, and more than a few sleepless nights spent doing research. I'd started preparing the moment I first heard rumors about a big property management company buying up local rentals. My ex-wife was checking her phone when I returned, probably already planning how to share her victory with friends. Her husband had loosened his tie slightly, the only crack in his otherwise perfect corporate armor. The coffee cups sat half empty on the table between us, marking the time that had passed since their arrival. You know, I said, settling back into my chair with the folder, it's funny how things work out sometimes. About 6 months ago, I was having lunch at that little diner down the street. You remember the one? I looked at my ex-wife, who nodded despite herself. And I overheard some interesting gossip about property acquisitions in the area. Her husband's hand twitched slightly. The business world is full of rumors, he said dismissively, but I caught the hint of uncertainty in his voice. True, I agreed, opening the folder carefully. But I've learned to pay attention to rumors, especially when they might affect my home. So I did something I probably should have done years ago. I started talking to a real estate attorney. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The smugness that had filled the air since their arrival began to thin out, replaced by something closer to concern. A dog barked outside, and a kid's bicycle bell rang cheerfully, but inside my living room, you could have heard a pin drop. A real estate attorney? My ex-wife repeated, her voice higher than usual. What for? I pulled out the first document, a copy of my original lease agreement. Well, at first, I just wanted to understand my rights as a tenant. But then my attorney pointed out something interesting in my lease. Something about a right of first refusal clause. Her husband sat up straighter, his professional mask slipping further. That's a standard clause, he said quickly. It doesn't mean anything without. Without proof of funds? I finished for him, pulling out another document. You mean like this pre-approved mortgage letter? Or maybe you're more interested in the purchase agreement I've been negotiating with the previous owners. The color drained from both their faces. My ex-wife's phone slipped from her hands onto the couch, forgotten. Outside, the Sunday morning continued as usual, neighbors chatting, cars passing, birds singing. But in my living room, time seemed to stand still. "That's impossible," her husband stammered, reaching for his briefcase. "The acquisition was confidential. How did you know about it?" I smiled, remembering all those evening phone calls with my attorney. Let's just say I learned something important from our divorce. Always be prepared for the unexpected. When I heard those rumors, I started putting money aside, built up my credit score, got all my paperwork in order, just in case. My ex-wife's hands were trembling slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. "You can't possibly have enough money to buy the house." I laid out another document. "You'd be surprised how much someone can save when they're motivated." Plus, the bank was very interested in my loan application, especially given my rental history and the property's value. The sound of children playing drifted through the window, a stark contrast to the heavy silence in the room. I watched as they exchanged glances, their perfect plan crumbling before their eyes. Of course, I continued, shuffling through more papers. I wasn't planning to move this quickly. I was going to wait until my lease was up naturally. But since you're so eager to terminate it early, I spread the documents across the coffee table, covering their eviction notice. "I suppose we might as well move forward with the purchase now." A lawnmower started up somewhere nearby, its steady hum filling the silence that followed. My ex-wife's designer dress suddenly looked out of place in my modest living room, and her husband's expensive watch seemed to weigh heavy on his wrist. "You see," I said, leaning back in my chair, "sometimes the worst thing you can do is underestimate someone, especially someone who's already survived losing everything once before." The morning sun had climbed higher now, casting new shadows across the room. In those shadows, I could almost see the ghosts of who we used to be, the married couple who once shared a life, the man who'd been broken by divorce, the woman who'd moved on so quickly. But those ghosts were fading now, replaced by who we'd become. The papers spread across my coffee table told a story different from the one my ex-wife and her husband had expected to write today. I watched as her husband picked up the purchase agreement, his fingers leaving slight creases on the corners. His eyes darted back and forth, probably searching for any loophole, any weakness in my position. "This is," he started, then cleared his throat. "This is quite thorough." I nodded, remembering all those late nights spent reviewing documents, asking questions, making sure every detail was perfect. My attorney was very helpful. She has a particular interest in cases involving property law and tenant rights. My ex-wife leaned forward, her designer dress rustling against the couch. "But why go through all this trouble?" she asked, genuine confusion in her voice. "You could have just found another place to rent, something even better than this." I looked around my living room, at the wall where I'd marked my nephew's growing height over the past 3 years, the window seat where I'd spent countless evenings reading, the corner where my houseplants had flourished under my care. "Because this isn't just a house anymore," I said quietly. "It's where I rebuilt my life." The morning had grown warmer, and a bead of sweat rolled down her husband's temple as he continued scanning the documents. The tick of my wall clock seemed louder now, marking each moment of their dawning realization. "The previous owners," her husband said suddenly, looking up. "They never mentioned any pending sale agreements." "They wouldn't have," I replied, pulling out another document from my folder. "The negotiations were confidential, protected under a non-disclosure agreement, just like your company's acquisition plans were supposed to be." That hit home. He tugged at his tie again, the knot now noticeably loose. My ex-wife's perfect posture had begun to slip, her shoulders dropping slightly as she processed what was happening. "But the timing," she protested. "How could you possibly have known that you'd try something like this?" I finished for her. The question hung in the air between us. I didn't, not specifically. But I'd learned something important from our divorce: always be ready for the unexpected. A neighbor's wind chimes tinkled through the open window, their gentle sound at odds with the tension in the room. My coffee had gone cold, but I took a sip anyway, letting them stew in the silence. "The purchase price," Her husband tried again, his voice taking on a negotiating tone. "We could make you a better offer. After all, with our resources." "Isn't for negotiation," I cut in firmly. "The terms were already agreed upon months ago. Your company's acquisition doesn't change that. In fact," I added, pulling out one final document, "it actually works in my favor." Their eyes locked onto the paper as I laid it on top of the others. It was a letter from my attorney, explaining how their attempt to terminate my lease early had triggered an acceleration clause in my purchase agreement. "You see," I explained, watching their expressions change, "by trying to evict me, you've actually sped up the purchase process. Instead of waiting until my lease ends naturally, I can now exercise my right to buy immediately." My ex-wife's hand found her husband's arm, but this time it wasn't a gesture of triumph, it was one of support. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely, like a tide pulling away from the shore. "I don't understand," she said softly, more to herself than to me. "This isn't how this was supposed to go." I thought about all the times during our divorce when I'd felt helpless, when it seemed like every decision was being made for me. "Life rarely goes the way we expect it to," I replied. "The trick is being prepared for when it takes an unexpected turn." The morning sun had reached its full strength now, streaming through my windows and illuminating the dust motes in the air. They danced above the papers on my coffee table, above the carefully laid plans of both sides, above the remains of their failed power play. "So what happens now?" her husband asked, his corporate mask finally cracking completely. I gathered the documents back into my folder, each paper representing a step in my journey from victim to victor. "Now," I said calmly, "we let our attorneys handle the details. Unless, of course, you'd like to try to explain to your board of directors why you've accidentally accelerated the sale of this property to the very tenant you were trying to evict." The silence in my living room was deafening. The confident pair who had arrived at my doorstep just hours ago now sat deflated on my couch, their grand plans scattered across my coffee table like fallen leaves. My ex-wife's husband had finally given up on his tie completely, and her perfect makeup couldn't hide the flush of embarrassment on her cheeks. "I need to make some calls," her husband said suddenly, standing up and pulling out his phone. His hands were shaking slightly as he walked toward my front door. Through the window, I watched him pace back and forth on my porch, gesturing frantically as he spoke. My ex-wife stayed seated, staring at her reflection in her now empty coffee cup. "You've changed," she said quietly, not looking up. "Had to," I replied, gathering the documents back into their folder. "Cervical has a way of teaching you things about yourself." Outside, a group of kids rode past on their bikes, their laughter floating through the window. One of them rang their bell, the cheerful sound a stark contrast to the tension in my living room. I remembered how many times I'd sat in this very spot, watching life go by outside, while I figured out how to rebuild mine. "We really thought," she started, then stopped herself. "I mean, he said it would be simple. Just business, nothing personal." She laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "I guess we underestimated you." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since they'd arrived. The designer dress, the expensive jewelry, the carefully maintained appearance, all of it was armor, just like my folder full of documents was mine. "You know what's funny?" I said, adjusting a frame on the wall that had gone slightly crooked. "When we were married, I'd always thought you were the prepared one. Always planning ahead, always thinking 3 steps forward. I learned that from you, actually." She glanced up sharply, surprise crossing her face. Through the window, I could still see her husband pacing, now talking to what seemed to be a different person on his phone. "The divorce was hard," I continued, watching a bird land on my front yard's cherry tree. "Really hard. But it taught me something important. Sometimes losing everything is just life's way of teaching you how to build something better." The morning had warmed considerably, and the ice in our forgotten glasses had long since melted. A neighbor's lawnmower had started up again, its steady hum filling the awkward silence between us. "The house," she said finally. "You're really going to buy it?" I nodded, patting the folder of documents. "Already am, technically. The paperwork's been in process for months. Your surprise visit today just moved up the timeline." Her husband burst back through the door, his face a mix of anger and defeat. "The board wants an emergency meeting," he announced, his corporate confidence now completely shattered. They're not happy about the potential PR nightmare if this gets out. I couldn't help but smile at that. Funny how things work out, isn't it? You came here thinking you'd be evicting a helpless tenant, but instead we've handed you the perfect leverage to fast-track your purchase, he finished, slumping back onto my couch. The expensive watch on his wrist caught the sunlight, but somehow it didn't shine as brightly as before. My ex-wife stood up, smoothing her dress in a gesture I recognized from our married days, something she did when she needed to regain control. "We should go," she said, touching her husband's shoulder. "The board will be waiting." I walked them to the door, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Through the window, I could see their luxury car parked in my driveway, the one they'd arrived in with such confidence just hours ago. Now it seemed more like a getaway vehicle. "One more thing," I said as they stepped onto my porch. They turned, perhaps expecting one final twist of the knife. Instead, I smiled genuinely. "Thank you." "Thank you," her husband repeated, confusion clear on his face. "Yes," I nodded. "If you hadn't tried to force me out today, I might have waited months before finalizing the purchase." Sometimes our worst enemies do us the biggest favors without even knowing it. The morning sun was high now, casting short shadows on my front lawn. The cherry tree's leaves rustled in a gentle breeze, and some way down the street, a car horn honked briefly. Just another Sunday in the neighborhood, except everything had changed. I stood in my doorway, watching their expensive car pull away from my driveway. The sound of gravel crunching under their tires grew fainter until it disappeared completely, leaving behind the normal Sunday morning sounds of my neighborhood. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the warm breeze wash over me, carrying away the tension of the last few hours. Walking back inside, I noticed they'd left their coffee cups on my table, two half-empty reminders of their failed attempt to upend my life. I picked them up, thinking about how differently this morning could have gone if I hadn't been prepared. The dishes clinked softly as I carried them to the kitchen sink. My phone buzzed, a message from my attorney. "Just got a call from their legal team," it read. "They want to expedite the purchase process. Seems they're eager to resolve this quietly." I smiled, setting the phone down beside the sink as I washed the coffee cups. The morning newspaper still lay on my kitchen table, forgotten since their arrival. The headlines about rising property values in the area seemed almost ironic now. I sat down, picking up where I'd left off, but my mind kept wandering back to everything that had just happened. 3 years ago, when I'd first walked into this house, I'd been a different person. Broken by divorce, unsure of the future, just looking for a place to hide while I put myself back together. The empty rooms had echoed with my footsteps, and the bare walls had seemed to mock my loneliness. But day by day, I'd built something here. Each picture I hung, each piece of furniture I carefully chose, each plant I nurtured, they were all small victories. Proof that I could create something new from the ashes of what I'd lost. Standing up, I walked through each room of my house, soon to be mine in more than just spirit. The living room where I'd hosted game nights with new friends. The spare bedroom I turned into a home office where I'd rebuilt my career. The kitchen where I've learned to cook for one, then discovered I actually enjoyed it. In the hallway, I paused at the growth chart marked on the wall, tracing my fingers over the pencil lines showing my nephew's height over the years. Each mark represented a Sunday afternoon visit, a moment of joy, a reminder that family isn't limited to marriage certificates. The sound of children playing outside drifted through my open windows, mixed with the distant bark of a dog and the rustle of leaves in the cherry tree. Normal sounds, everyday sounds, but they felt different now, more permanent somehow. My phone buzzed again. Another message from my attorney about setting up a meeting to finalize the paperwork. The business side of things would need attention, but that could wait. Right now, I just wanted to savor this moment. I walked back to my favorite armchair, the one I'd bought during that winter sale. Settling into it, I looked at the spot where my ex-wife and her husband had sat just hours ago. They'd come here expecting to find the same broken person from 3 years ago. Instead, they'd found someone stronger, someone prepared, someone who'd learned from the past instead of being trapped by it. The morning sun had reached the perfect angle, streaming through my windows and warming the room. I picked up my coffee cup, the one I'd never finished earlier, and walked to the kitchen to make a fresh pot. Some victories deserve to be celebrated, even if you're celebrating alone. As I waited for the coffee to brew, I thought about all the twists and turns that had led to this moment. The divorce that had seemed like an ending but turned out to be a beginning. The lonely nights that had taught me self-reliance. The small victories that had built my confidence. Even my ex-wife's attempt to take away my home had backfired, becoming the very thing that helped me secure it forever. The coffee maker beeped, and I poured myself a fresh cup. Walking to my back porch, I sat in my favorite spot, listening to the wind chimes I'd hummed last spring. A pair of cardinals played in the bird bath I'd installed, splashing water in the morning sun. In the distance, church bells started ringing, marking the hour. Their sound rolled across the neighborhood, mixing with the laughter of children, the hum of lawnmowers, and all the other sounds of a normal Sunday morning. But for me, everything had changed. I took a sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. Sometimes the sweetest victories aren't about getting even or proving something to others. Sometimes they're about proving something to yourself, that you can survive, adapt, and come back stronger than before. The rest of Sunday stretched ahead of me, peaceful and bright. Tomorrow, I'd deal with paperwork and lawyers and all the details of becoming a homeowner. But today was for savoring this moment, for appreciating how far I'd come, and for being thankful that sometimes life's worst surprises can lead to the best outcomes.